Welcome back. If you remember last time, we were talking about the government's responsibility to ensure that people have equal access to the voting booth under the 15th Amendment. We're going to continue our discussion of the constitutional amendments, and we're going to continue and close out our discussion of the Constitution, at least the literal Constitution, after this session. The 16th Amendment deals with the legalization or the constitutionality of a tax that is not influenced by the census or any other type of enumeration. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. The 16th Amendment is the legalization or the constitutionality process that serves that the income tax is legal and legitimate and that we all have to pay the income tax. So please pay your taxes. The 17th Amendment changes the election of senators from the legislative process to the popular process, voting. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. When vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority of such state shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election as the legislature may direct. This amendment shall not be so construed as to affect the election or term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. So now we have the popular election of senators. The 18th Amendment. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverages purposes is hereby prohibited. Of course, this experiment in prohibition resulted in being overturned by 1933 and also gave a great deal of power to bootleggers and organized crime. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Women get the right to vote. Now, one of the things that I would like you to notice is how this change of the franchise, how the change of how people are viewed is expanded through this amendment process. First, they started counting African Americans as 3/5 of a person. After the Civil War, men that were slaves were now entitled to full citizenship and full rights as human beings. Years later, in 1920, women are given the right to vote and all the legal entitlements and privileges that men were. And so you see again this sort of aspirational aspect, this living, breathing document that changes from generation to generation, but remains to have the supreme law of the land and remains to have these protections of the individual vis-a-vis the state. The 20th Amendment changes the inauguration day from March 4th to January because during the time of the Depression, Hoover was defeated, Roosevelt was elected president, and from November to March, the economy took a very, very, very bad turn called the bank holiday, and we had a lame duck president, and Roosevelt wasn't able to take office until March. So they changed this. If you look, ratified January 23rd, 1933. One of the important aspects of the New Deal and Roosevelt's administration was to change the inauguration from March 4th to January. The terms of the president and vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of the senators and representatives at noon on the third day of January of the years in which such terms would have ended if this article had not been ratified, and the terms of their successors shall then begin. Section 2. The Congress shall reassemble, and at least once every year, and such meetings shall begin at noon on the third day of January, unless they shall by law appoint a different day. Section 3. If at the same time fixed at the beginning of the term of the president-elect shall have died, the vice president-elect shall become president. If a president shall not have been chosen before the time fixed for the beginning of his term, or if the president-elect shall have failed to qualify, then the vice president-elect shall act as president until a president shall have qualified, and the Congress may by law provide for this case wherein neither a president-elect nor a vice president-elect shall have qualified, declaring who shall then act as president, or in the manner which one whose act shall be selected, and such person shall act accordingly until a president or vice president shall have qualified. Section 4. The Congress may by law provide for the case of the death of any of the persons from whom the House of Representatives may choose a president whenever the rights of the choice shall have devolved upon them, and for the case of the death of any person from whom the Senate may choose a vice president whenever the right of choice shall have devolved upon them. Section 5. Sections 1 and 2 shall take effect on the 15th day of October following the ratification of this article. Section 6. This article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by the legislature of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission. This time element is very interesting because there is an amendment near the end of the Constitution that was supposed to be part of the first original 10 Bill of Rights. And it sat around and it sat around and it sat around. And it did not have this expiration date. And it's the amendment that basically says Congress cannot give itself a raise until another election. And so a group of political activists got together. They realized it only would take a handful of states. And because it did not have this time element to the amendment, it succeeded. The 21st Amendment is the annulment of Prohibition. The 18th article of the amendment of the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. So we can have a drink. The 22nd Amendment. This is the amendment that puts a term limit on presidents. And it was really the Republican Party that, after Roosevelt's four elections, wanted to codify Washington's 2-term limit tradition. And so they passed this amendment in 1951. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once. But this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of the president when this article was proposed by Congress, and shall not prevent any person who may be holding the office of president or acting as president during the term within which this article becomes operative from the holding of office of president or acting as president during the remainder of the such term. That was Harry Truman. Harry Truman was Roosevelt's vice president. Harry Truman became president after Roosevelt died, was reelected in 1948, and then had the option to run. He was pretty unpopular, but had the option to run for reelection, but decided not to, and Eisenhower ran in 52 and was elected. Section 2, this article shall be inoperative unless it shall be been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by the legislature of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission to the states by the Congress. Again, that time sort of expiration date. The 23rd Amendment. The district constituting the seat of government of the United States shall appoint in such manner as the Congress may direct a number of electors for president and vice president equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in Congress to which the district would be entitled if it were a state, but in no event more than the least populous state. They shall be, in addition to those appointed by the states, they shall be considered for the purposes of the election of president and vice president to be electors appointed by a state. and they shall meet the district and perform such duties as provided by the 12th article of the amendment. So people in DC, people who live in DC, can vote for president and vice president. They still do not have members of Congress, but those electors act as if they did. The 24th Amendment, the right of the citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, for electors for the president or vice president, for the senator or representative in Congress, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. Poll tax prevents poor people from voting. Again, look at the dates. 1964, approximately 95 years after the 14th, 13th, and 15th Amendments were passed. And so it took that long to get full enforcement of people's voting. The 25th Amendment changes the way the president, the line of succession happens, and brings in the Speaker of the House, and also deals with issues such as incapacity of the president. This was talked a lot about during when Reagan was shot, and also it's talked a lot about the people who are opposed to Trump. This is sort of their fantasy. In the case of the removal of the president from office or his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. Section 2. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by the majority vote of both houses of Congress. All right, this has happened in our history. Let me review something. If you remember, I talked about President Nixon not being impeached, which is correct. However, President Nixon did resign from office. And who was his vice president? Well, when President Nixon ran for office in 1968, and he had a man, so Nixon was elected president, and a man named Spiro Agnew was elected vice president. Spiro Agnew had been the governor of Maryland, and he was a county commissioner in Baltimore. And 4 years later, Nixon and Agnew are reelected in 1972. Watergate happens, and in the midst of Watergate, it's discovered that Agnew took bribes. He was convicted of taking bribes as a county commissioner in Baltimore. So Nixon forces Agnew to retire or resign, and the minority leader of the House of Representatives, Gerald Ford, Nixon selects to become vice president. Both houses of Congress vote him in, and he becomes vice president. Later on, Nixon resigns the presidency. Ford becomes president and names Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. Gerald Ford is the only person who's ever been president of the United States and was not elected to either vice president or president. Continuing with the 25th Amendment, Section 3. Whenever the President transmits to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits them to a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the Vice President, acting President. Section 4. Whenever the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the Executive Department or such other body as Congress may by law provide transmit to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting President. Thereafter, when the President transmits to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that no inability exists, he shall resume the powers and duties of his office, unless the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the Executive Department or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit within 4 days to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Thereupon, Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session. If the Congress within 21 days after receipt of the later written declaration, or if Congress is not in session within 21 days after Congress is required to assemble, determines by 2/3 vote both houses that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall continue to discharge the same as acting President. Otherwise, the President shall assume the powers and duties of his office. Now, if you remember, people were talking about this in great detail when it pertained to President Trump. But more realistically and also more reasonably, this process happens when the president goes under surgery or when the president is in case, God forbid, a president is stricken by a stroke or some other infirmity. Amendment 26. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. So now everyone can vote who's 18 years old or older. Again, that expansion of the franchise, that expansion of how we look, who is a person, who should vote. And the 27th Amendment. No law varying the compensation for service of the Senate and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. This again was passed in 1992, as I said, and it basically means that there must be an election before you have a raise in pay for any member of Congress or the president. It was originally part of the 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights, and it didn't have that time expiration element, so that it just sat there and sat there and sat there, and now it's part of the Constitution. So that's the Constitution. The Constitution, as I said, are the rules of the road, the supreme law of the land, and in our situation, it is the guiding light and the guiding organization of this class. So how do I want you to study for the Constitution? How do I want you to relate to the Constitution? I do not want you to memorize the Constitution. I do not want you to memorize the amendments or the preamble. As you may have noticed, I made an error and I said 28 amendments, and of course they're 27. So that's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is you to have a familiarity with the Constitution. So when someone says the Second Amendment, you know it's guns. When someone says the Fourth Amendment, you know it's searches and seizures. When someone says the 15th Amendment, you know that it's voting rights. Because if you can do that, if you can understand the Constitution, if you can understand how it is a living document, how it is so important for our society, then that you can carry that through in your everyday life. So again, if you want to memorize the Constitution, that's fine. You will be asked questions on the exams of the Constitution, and you'll be asked to identify amendments. I find for the students that it's the easiest thing to do is to personify and put in your own words and figure it out in your own way what these amendments mean. This is what the Constitution is. We have so many people who talk about the importance of the Constitution, and they quote and they act, and yet in the back of my mind I ask myself, have you ever really read the Constitution? Well, you all have, and I congratulate you for doing so, because the Constitution, a short document, a document that does not travel well, meaning that other countries who try to adopt our system don't do so very well, because the Constitution is also an expression of belief, an expression of the American nation, of how your race, your language, how you were born is not important. What's important is your acceptance of popular sovereignty, rule of law, and tolerance. And how, as we have grown in a society, as we've grown and matured as a country, our perspective, what is an individual? Who should have the privileges and the immunities of a citizen? What type of sovereignty and what type of nation do we want? All these things are wrapped up, and we can identify all of these things in that document that we call the U.S. Constitution. In our next session, we're going to go through the essay and the important speech on the African American perspective of the U.S. Constitution. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.